I pulled back on my bow's string until it was ready to snap, and in the split-second chance let go of the string. The string snapped back into its neutral position, and a lethal arrow went slicing through the air from my position on the balcony of the meeting hall into the chest of the helpless king. He fell to the ground as the bystanders began screaming and shouting in a panicked voice. I didn't get to see what happened next because I retreated from the scene that I had just begun. I swiftly maneuvered the quiet streets of Sicily. With one glance over my shoulder, I inserted and rotated the key in the door, and the lock clicked open, allowing me to enter. The stairwell that I now occupied is dark except for a light at the bottom of the steps. Once down the flight of stairs, I was confronted by a man armed with a torch in his left hand and a sharp iron sword in the other. I exclaimed as if I knew what he was going to ask. "I am here to see Baldric." He lowered his guard, sheathed his sword, and escorted me down a musty corridor into a small room with a table in the middle of the room and two chairs. From the light of the torch the guard was holding behind me, I could make out the shadow of a male figure in the corner of the room. The figure crept out of the shadows wearing a light brown shirt and some matching pants that was riddled with holes showing its age. He pulled out of his pants pocket a sack and tossed it to me. I caught it and released its contents into my hand. I counted each and every coin until I was satisfied by my pay. Maskey, will you now explain to me exactly how this played out so I know my story if anyone questions me? I quickly replayed the occurrence in my head and relayed to him the information that he requested. He had a slight grin on his face during my recollection of the night that hinted that he was either pleased with my work or just happy that the king was dead. Baldric was exiled from the town after he had gotten into a fight with another politician. As I turned my back to him and took a stride towards the way I'd entered, Baldric grabbed my shoulder. "I have one more job for you to complete, if you are up to the task. My brother, who lives south of here, in the town of Cree, helped the king banish me from this land." I replied, "I shall do your bidding, quickly and without a trace." Baldric walked me back out of his hideout, and I returned to my house a few blocks away and packed for the next day's journey. I packed 2 pairs of clothes and some grain and bread. I slipped the picture of my parents out of my shirt pocket and gently placed it on the table. I carry this picture around to remember them, as they died when I was only 5 years old. I am now 16 and am having to survive on my own and what they had left me. My caretaker had sparked an interest in me to be an archer when I was a very young boy. He told me that I would be very good when I mastered the art. He died when I was only 10, then I was truly left with nobody. With a tear in my eye, I walked upstairs, changed, and got into bed. I closed my eyes and immediately fell asleep. The next day I rose from my slumber and dressed myself appropriately for the upcoming adventure. I swung the door of the cabinet open and grabbed a slice of bread. I swallowed the bread like I hadn't eaten in a week. With remnants of crumbs left around my mouth, I opened the door and stood face to face with the bright sun. I walked out into the jumble of traders, trying to bargain prices to where they wanted. I ignored the regular bustle of a Wednesday morning and walked to the city gate, where a guard asked me if I knew anything about the death of the king. I replied with the same straight face that I had equipped when I had walked up. He took my word and released me into the outside world. I walked all day until I realized that the sun was setting, so I began to set up camp under a beautiful old oak tree. As I fell asleep that night, I wondered the real reason of why Baldric wanted his brother dead, but I couldn't envision any reason for such hatred. I left my question unanswered as I gently lay my head on a pillow made out of leaves and a blanket covering them. I awoke the next morning and realized something was moving behind the trees about 20 feet from my camp. I snatched my bow and an arrow and pulled the arrow back until the deerskin string wouldn't budge any further. I walked slowly over to the bush, not taking the slack off the bow string until I realized this thing that I was scared of was just a rabbit. I let the creature be and packed my stuff for the second half of my journey. I began to hear civilization again and created a covering for my belongings. I left them underneath a green bush about 35 feet from the entrance of the town. I casually walked into the town to do some recon on Baldric's brother. I walked up to a street vendor and asked for a bowl of soup and if he had any knowing of the whereabouts of Baldric's brother. He said he had heard the name before but wasn't familiar with whom or where he was. He did, however, refer me to the innkeeper. He informed me that the innkeeper knew all of the people that inhabit the land of Cree. I parted from his stand set for the inn. When I arrived at the inn, I was greeted by the innkeeper himself, and he exclaimed happily, "If you need anything, just ask." Even though I was compelled to ask the question that I was getting at immediately, I decided to make a conversation with him so that I didn't come off as suspicious. I started by asking his name, and to my astonishment, it was Baldric's brother, standing right before me. I asked if I could stay the night, and he gladly offered me a room on the second floor. He escorted me to my room and said that he needed to run an errand. I took this chance to set up my camp, and at the window that allowed me to see the entire street below, I picked my target from the crowd, brought my bow to a firing position, and realized that this wasn't my opportunity. I lowered my bow and put the arrow back into my quiver. I decided that I would keep watch until he returned to see if there would be a better opportunity. I waited 3 hours and began to lose hope when the sun started slouching behind the mountains in the distance. Just when I was about to give up, I spotted him walking in the distance. Quickly, I swung my arm over my shoulder to retrieve an arrow from my quiver and locked the bow's string in firing position. When he came into shooting range, I released the arrow, and it pierced straight through his thin wool shirt and straight into his stomach. Blood started gushing from the newly opened hole. I collected my gear and snuck out of the inn without notice and returned to the bush that I had left my stuff behind earlier that day. I decided that I should move quickly, just in case anybody noticed me. I arrived back at Baldric's den minutes before the sun rose, and he greeted me with the question on his face. Yes, he is no longer walking this earth. He replied, "I didn't think you had it in you, but here's your pay. I think you will be satisfied." This time, he walked into his dark back room and returned struggling with a sack that was as big as his head. I rushed over to help him and didn't even glance inside the bag. I knew this would last me a while. I turned and walked, thinking if I had really done the right thing. I came to the conclusion that it was just part of my job, and if I hadn't, then I wouldn't be carrying this sack of gold coins back to my room. A thought about my caretaker ran through my mind, about how proud he would have been to see my expertise in the art of archery.